Okay, uh, welcome to the stream. Here we are. It's been a long road to get here. Tried to do this, what was it, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and ran into technical difficulties. Tried to do it again, got sick. Still not really sick anymore, but just recovering from overusing my voice. So if I'm a little hoarse, that'll be why. Apologies. Uh, Also, apologies on some technical problems. You may notice this microphone is not the best. If you hear mouse clicks, that's because I don't have the best equipment right now. And we'll stick with just no video today. Probably won't have video for a while. I'm not much of a video guy. I'm more of a, well, I won't make excuses. We'll just move on. So, I don't expect too many people to tune in tonight, mainly because I did not publicize this whatsoever. Where the content today is sort of fly by the seat of our pants thing. Even though I've had like 3 weeks to work on it, I really haven't worked on it at all. I've kind of crammed for this. It's obviously Hiroki Azuma's database animals. We're going to be looking at database theory, why it's relevant, considering this book came out like 20 years ago, and uh, really, really what we're looking at, we'll find out in the last section of this presentation. This presentation is going to have like 3 parts to it. First part's really looking at the book itself. Second part is how this applies to sort of geek culture today, but not Japanese, Western culture today. And then the last part, we'll briefly look at why we should even care about it. So we'll go over that in a second. The whole stream here today, we'll be looking at, well, mainly just to see if I feel like doing this again, because I kind of feel like I should, because nobody really reads, and if you're looking to be a writer, you kind of have to have, well, you have to branch out from that. But I tell you what, man, being in front of a microphone, I've done lectures before, I've taught before. Being in front of a microphone where there's no audience is very nerve-wracking. So let's see if we can get through this, right? It'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. All right. Get into it. Well, like I said, we'll get into it in a second. Get yourself a drink if you want. And then the last part of the stream, I expect this content to last about probably pretty quick, 35, maybe 45 minutes tops. I don't expect it to take too long. And then at the end of this, I'll take a look at the chat, see if there's anybody in the chat. I don't really expect anybody tonight. And then we'll move on, do some quick announcements at the end, and move on. Now, for the most part, I do plan on doing more Catholic content. This obviously has nothing to do with Catholicism per se. So take that as you will, and move on. So again, apologies. I'm a little nervous, so we'll see how this goes. Hiroki Azuma, if I might be butchering his name, I'm no Japanese speaker, I won't pretend to be one, is a Japanese philosopher. He's still alive, he's still publishing, and he's still, I think, teaching, but I did not actually double check on that. And he's informed a lot by post-structural and post-modern theory, which you find heavily the French philosophers, with some of the Germans thrown in from late last century, 60s to 80s was kind of the heyday of French post-structuralism. Kind of a mouthful there, but yeah, it's just how it is. Baudrillard he cites heavily. Kojève he gets into a little bit, even though he's sort of the precursor to a lot of these guys. Derrida, of course. Foucault he doesn't touch on, for the better, because in my opinion there's not much worth touching on with Foucault that others haven't already done better jobs with. Well, we won't really get into any of them today. I don't really ever want to get into any of them because it's a bit of a headache and a nightmare. But with Azuma is looking, in this case, at media consumption and how people are consuming stories, entertainment, and what those stories and what that entertainment is in in his time, at the time he wrote this, contemporary culture, and he's looking at otaku in particular. This particular book was, I think, the second attempt at seriously studying the otaku. May have been the third. He cites one other book, and there was also Saito Tamaki's book, which was just a mess. But we're not looking at either one of those. We're looking at this one. So, in this book, it was published and written in 2001, I want to say. It did not make it over here until 2008 or 9. Might have been 07. I think it was 8 or 9. That was about when I read it. I read it in 2009 or so. And he was already dated at that point. The theory that he covers isn't dated, as we'll see in a moment, but all of his information is dated, and what he's looking at in terms of what otaku even are at the time is dated. So in order to understand how he's presenting this theory, it's worth looking at what the otaku even are very briefly. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. I've watched more than my fair share of Japanese media over my life, but more than I probably should have. So otaku, at the time that Azuma is writing this, he's characterizing them as being basically in their third generation. And the otaku in their third generation at this point in time, one of the most defining pieces of media is Evangelion, and we'll look into Evangelion in a second. Again, I don't want to get too deep into the otaku stuff because that's not really our point here. And he has a really interesting piece where he compares Mobile Suit Gundam with Evangelion. If you've never seen either of these shows, I'll try to be brief. If you have, then hopefully you know what I'm talking about. This is only important because of how the creators of certain kinds of otaku media were themselves influenced by previous otaku media, and you sort of end up with this like self-fulfilling system. The creators are influenced by other creators at a certain point. Obviously, there was a point in time where otaku didn't exist because this sort of Japanese geek culture, geek media didn't exist. But eventually it was introduced, and then the geek culture came along afterward, and then it kind of propelled itself forward. It just spiraled eventually. Now, in the 2000s, which is when he wrote this, the early 2000s, Evangelion was the big thing. You had pachinko machines, you had keychains, you had fobs, you had all sorts of merchandise. That started to change. But that part didn't really change. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. What eventually happened was you had the light novels started to really take off. They already existed before this. He actually covers a little bit of that, but they didn't become one of the defining pieces of otaku media until probably the mid-2000s or so. And then about 6 or 7 years after that, I'd say the early 2010s, it degenerated to the point where you had internet websites kind of driving even the light novel boom. And it's just been kind of, in my opinion, it's just been downhill since then. But I don't really pay attention to anime anymore, so it's whatever. Anyway, what we're looking at, back to our focus here, is what exactly is media? How exactly are these people consuming media? And what is the difference between both the way they consume media and also the media that is being consumed? Because both of these, the way they consumed media ended up changing how the media itself was produced. I'm talking about the shows, the comics, the stories themselves. These things changed as their understanding of the media changed. So that's how you go from one thing to the other. That's sort of my goal here at getting at, my roundabout way of getting at. 1 second. So important thing to note here, again, Ozma wrote this book about the otaku, but he even mentions in the first chapter that he does not believe that this change in media consumption or interpretation, if you want to think of it that way, was unique to the otaku. He considered that to be something that was fundamental to the postmodern condition, if you want to call it that. So you should be able to find this in any society that is functioning according to this sort of consumer model of entertainment. And you can't. You will see it, as you start hearing what we're talking about here, you should start to notice that, like, oh, hey, this is pretty much exactly like how the MCU is working, right? The Marvel Universe, how that stuff is being made by committee, how these stories aren't really stories at the end of the day. They're just sort of paint by numbers things. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Apologies. It's first time doing this. Let's see if I can stick through it to the end. So, where are we? We are here. Media. What is the media that we're talking about? What is the what are we talking about when we're looking at how media is consumed? It means that we're watching it, or reading it, or enjoying it in some way. And what is the difference between, say, how the otaku of Ozma's time, or even today, consume media versus like how earlier forms of otaku may have consumed media, otaku from the 80s, for instance, or just in a less Japanese setting, how look at the difference between how the self-professed geeks of today are consuming media, or with their Funko Pops and their Star Wars. Well, Star Wars really kind of sank, but the MCU, I guess, is still big. I don't even know what's big anymore. This last year kind of wiped out a lot of, seemed to wipe out a lot of big franchises for the better. But that kind of thing, how they consumed it versus how movies from 20 years beforehand, or even 30 years beforehand, how those movies were written, produced, directed, acted, shot. Like, what's the difference here? I would try to use books, but like I said, I don't think anybody actually reads anymore, because even thinking about what books are popular, and it's like they're books people don't read. Nobody really seems to. If you think of most popular books in the last 10, 15 years, and they're books that were written before then. Even all of our references that we keep getting hammered with by people in the media of political figures and things like this, they're still referencing stuff that was written in the 90s or earlier. So I don't think people read. I don't think people are writing books so much. So movies are the next best thing, right? So with that in mind, we'll just dive right into the heart of what Azuma was looking at, which was narratives versus databases. The theory, his theory is called the database theory. I presume he's the guy that coined this, because I haven't found anybody that uses the term in this way that isn't referencing him. Now, maybe I just haven't done my homework. I don't know. I think I have. I think I've done enough homework. But like I said, so we have this. I just pulled it from the internet here. On the left, you see sort of how he considers media supposed to be made and perceived and enjoyed and consumed. And then the left is a much more raw consumer way of doing it. Now, these images aren't the best, in my opinion, but they kind of get at what he's talking about. I'm not going to go through and try to parse what he's doing, because anybody that has tried to study continental philosophy knows that it's a mess, both in terms of the kinds of terminology they use and how they'll use just... I'm bad enough at trying to roundabout way get around to talking about what I'm trying to be talking about. Continental philosophy is even worse. So we'll pick this apart in a very minor way first. On the left, you can see you have something which is supposed to be say the story, right? The story and the theme and the thing that the media is that you're there to enjoy, and you see a certain surface of this, and by viewing the surface or reading the text, you could say, you get at the meat of what the story is. So, in less obtuse terms, you walk into English class, you did your homework, you read Charles Dickens, whatever. You read the text on the page, you could read that there are characters interacting with each other, doing things, and these characters served parts of the story that if these characters didn't do these actions, the story would not unfold the way it was supposed to, and that this is, you're by understanding this, you're getting deeper past the surface of the story to the point where you're understanding what the writer, Dickens, is trying to get at by making these characters the way they are, making them interact with each other the way that they interact in the world that they inhabit, so that you come away with like, oh, okay, that's what Dickens was saying, right? Hopefully that makes sense. The story is complete. There's really nothing you need outside of the story to service your understanding of the story, other than things like common sense, maybe some understanding of cultural norms. If you need that, that's kind of irrelevant most of the time, but whatever. That's kind of the old. Azuma's point is that's kind of the old way of doing things. That's the intuitive way of doing things for most of us, but it's also kind of the old way of doing things. Excuse me 1 second here. Take a drink. Now, the right side is where things start to get a little weird and schizophrenic, right? So the right side is suggesting that there ultimately is no sort of root substance of the media that's going to be consumed. It's not like a self-contained point or thing that's being brought across by the writer. Let's say there is a writer. Instead, it's more like a toolbox. It's a bunch of different things that all refer to different aspects of what you're seeing on the surface. Now, think of it this way. You're going to read something that is a derivative of you're going to read something that is a derivative of Dickens. We'll go with the Dickens thing. It's kind of hard to do because it 19th century literature didn't totally work this way, but we could imagine, like Pulp Fiction from the turn of the 20th century, we could think of it this way. You're going to read something that's highly in a medium that has a high volume of derivation. There's a lot of different kinds of fly-by-night kind of stories that a lot of people read different ones of, but nobody really remembers because they just don't have much staying power, but they all share certain things in common. So because they all share these certain things in common, you have this kind of popular cultural understanding of a genre that starts to exist. Hard-boiled detective fiction is an example. Science fiction, high fantasy, low fantasy, urban fantasy, young adult, you get the idea, right? Even though you do have certain works that kind of pioneer these genres, the reality is that most, if not everything that is written in them is kind of basically trash, which is fine, but it's basically trash. So because it's basically trash, and there's a high degree of derivation, where you have a lot of these similar kinds of works all using similar kinds of, well, I hate to use the word tropes because it's kind of a weird Reddit term now, but that kind of thing. Similar character types, similar circumstances that happen, similar twists. And novelty is so valued in these things that eventually you have this point where you have stories that are trying to riff off of the fact that they're those kinds of stories, and that's kind of where usually the media finally dies. But who knows? Sometimes it's these days it seems to last forever because it's people are so creatively bankrupt. But as a result of this, when you, the reader or viewer, reader, whatever, is interpreting, is consuming really this medium, this media, you already are familiar with kind of the general rule set of how this story is supposed to function. A story of this type is supposed to function. So you're not necessarily going to the story on its own grounds. You're already assuming that the story is operating under a certain kind of logic, meta logic maybe, and you are putting that into, you're putting yourself into that context so that the whole, so that you know how to interpret it, right? On some degree, we kind of do that with everything that we consume, but I think when we're consuming this type of media, we're doing it a little bit more intentionally. Like we're more aware of it. You know, obviously, when I'm reading Charles Dickens, because I've read him before, I have a certain expectation of what great expectation of what I'm going in with. But likewise, if I'm going to read, another serial novelist of the time period, I kind of know a little bit of what I'm getting into. But because the stories are written a little differently, they don't. They're not reliant on something like genre, like in a popular culture sense, like genre, like that. So, what happens when you have this high degree of derivation within these genres, I guess, you cease to have really an original kind of work. You have, you have you have something. Again, I apologize, I'm getting ahead of myself. We have two kinds of derivation that we're dealing with. Your first kind of derivation is the derivation of, somebody does a hard-boiled detective fiction that sells a lot, and then you have people that sort of copycat that and put their own twists on it and imitate the writing style, imitate the characters that are involved, imitate the situations, the tropes, etc., whatever. There's that kind of narrative derivation. Now, you didn't have this type of thing 100 years ago, but you certainly have it now, where you have a second kind of categorically different sort of derivation, which is referring to basically merchandising. Merchandising, right? Your merchandise surrounding this media, like, in the case of mentioned Evangelion earlier, you had posters, your pachinko machines, you had your other series, your manga spin-off, right? Or repackaging, whatever it was called, the one Sadamoto wrote. You have your alternative tellings of the movies. You have all these different sorts of media that may not supply narrative because they might just be pictures, but they're contributing to the overall thing that is, in this case, Evangelion, right? You see Rei Ayanami on a billboard someplace, and or advertising as part of some sort of ad campaign. Well, you may not have ever seen Evangelion, but you are at least familiar with who this character is. Back 100 years ago, that wasn't possible because you didn't have a character from a Dickens novel selling you Pepsi. Even though Pepsi or Coke, whatever, existed, you didn't have that, right? It just didn't happen because you didn't have a consumer culture back then. Today you do. That's what consumerism is. It's sort of a fragmenting of these things that used to be maybe not perfect or whatever, but like more or less self-contained. Now they're not self-contained anymore. And Azuma's point is that's basically what Azuma's getting at with this whole database idea, is that these stories are no longer, one, these stories are no longer self-contained, but two, as a result of these stories no longer being self-contained, they stop really being stories the same way. They become fundamentally postmodern in the sense that where then is the original? We can talk about, say, Evangelion as like the Evangelion show and just talk about the show, but that's incomplete, because Evangelion is not just the show. There's more to it than just the show. You in order to, as is famously recognized, in order to even understand what half the stuff is that's going on in like the the world building element, you end up having to look up like absurd levels of autistic, details about the world that only get published in random stuff here and there. Now you can still interpret, in some cases, you can still interpret some of this stuff and just stick to the show, right? But the problem is that you have to go out of your way to do that. That's not necessarily the default position of consuming this type of media, nor really is it really the complete picture of consuming the media, because that's again different. This is where you start to get into a difference between interpreting a story and consuming media. When you think of consuming media, you think of consuming just like you're consuming food. Are you actually getting nourishment from it? Well, whatever. You get the idea. Like you're consuming it, and it's being on a surface level, it's being bought and paid for. So there's a monetary transaction, and that's propelling some economic factor. But in a more important sense, in a more immediate sense, here you're consuming it with the intention that you're just going to consume it and then eventually throw it out. Now, obviously, Evangelion became such a huge thing, and it ended up, despite what's supposed to be the moral of the story, sort of became a bit of an obsession for people. But that's a story for a different day. But you get, I hope I'm kind of getting at this. I'm not watching the chat, so I'm kind of again speaking into the void here at my computer screen and seeing how it goes. But hopefully I'm not sounding too disorganized about this. Let me take another swig of water here. This is the problem with audio only, is like when I give lectures, I can actually just like drink from a water bottle, and it doesn't seem as weird. But this is like, oh, hang on a second, let me drink my water in front of the microphone here. All right, so what have we covered here? We've covered otaku culture and media, how media is consumed, and how consumer culture changes how we consume media, but also, hopefully, I've tried to get at, it's also changed how the media itself is made. Because when you're making this media to be consumed, it's sort of the classic thing of boardroom storyboarding, right? Like or corporate storyboarding, where like the writer, oh, I'm such a pained artist, I'm trying to get my story out to the masses, and then the guys at corporate smoking their cigars and avoiding certain stereotypes just sort of take red pen to your thing and red pen to your script and rip it apart, and they're like, we need X, Y, and Z because that's what sells, and that kind of thing. It's like it's obviously a meme, but at the same time, anybody who watched the most recent Star Wars trilogy over the last 5 years or so, I didn't watch the last one, but like with Force Awakens and the other ones, like it's so obviously corporate. there's nothing left. It's just, here, let's rehash stuff we think makes sense, we think is going to sell. And the sad part is people actually bought it. People really were like, yeah, that seems fine to me. But it's like, okay. So getting back to the topic, the database that he's talking about is that it is, as you see on the left side of the screen there, the database is the what should be the substance of this product, of this media. When you're looking at this media where it's highly derivative and there's all these different pieces to it in terms of there's all these different versions of it, both in the merchandising sense, but also in the narrative sense, where we have all these different kind of knockoffs and the knockoffs of the knockoffs. You end up just with like, okay, if I'm going to understand this story that I'm going to read, I already know based on the title, based on how it's advertised, based on what kind of names are involved, perhaps, that it's going to be constructed of certain components. All right. My main character is probably going to fit one of three type of character types. He's going to have only a handful of different sorts of motivations. He's going to. You can see where I'm going with this. You're putting together your expectations of the story according to basically like navigating a tree diagram. And for the most part, you tend to be right. You look at the young adult. About 10 years ago, there was that huge glut of dystopian young adult TV shows, I guess, but like also movies, with the Hunger Games and all the other clones. It's the same kind of thing. It wasn't quite as bad, but it was the same kind of thing where it's like, all right, my main character is going to be X. There's going to be this type of dystopian setup that's there, and there's going to be this type of conflict that's probably artificial that gets everybody to interact with each other, and it's like, it becomes kind of an assembly line storytelling, right? Now, I know that what I'm talking about right now is not big brain stuff. Most people catch on to this. Most of us recognize this, and most of us think, well, wait, that's just how writing is, right? That's just how movies are. That's just how fiction is. But that's not really how fiction is supposed to be or how movies are supposed to be, right? I hope we all kind of recognize that, especially after the last 10 years of complete dreck that's been coming out of Hollywood, and the having this, geek culture foisted on us, on the whole country in this very kind of gross way with the MCU, just these movies that are advertisements for themselves without substance. You end up, you're like, all right, these movies it's the same movie over and over again, and it's not even trying to hide the fact anymore. That's the database at work. And if you like the database, then you like the movie, because or the media or whatever. If you like the database, then you like the media. But if you don't like the database, then you don't want to watch whatever this particular media that's in question is. Seems to make sense, right? All right. Any questions? Just kidding. I can't see anyway. So that's the database. So let's move along and get into. I could use a couple of quotes here from Azuma. I actually pulled a bunch of quotes, but I haven't been using them because I'm an amateur. That's why, really. It's my first time doing it. I over-prepared, which is good, and I'm sort of losing the plot a little bit. Apologies. I'm also a little bit over time for where I wanted to be. So let's switch gears to. Actually, I think I'm right on time. I'm right on time, right? We've covered the otaku, we've covered the database theory, and we've covered contemporary media. So let's switch gears a little bit and look at why this is relevant to, say, people who might read the Pillarist, which is where my stuff is, or might be familiar with sort of the side of the aisle that I'm on, right? Why do we care about media consumption, how it's consumed? There's two reasons why we might want to care about this. One reason is kind of a really important reason and too big for this presentation. That is aesthetics. Like, that's going to be a whole thing on its own. I may or may not ever talk about it because I don't know if I'm going to do this again. I probably will. I don't know. I don't know yet. But aesthetics is really important, and aesthetics comes down to both how things are made and how they're interpreted. I hate to use the word consumed, but basically, what is the point of beauty? Aesthetics is obviously the study of beauty. Well, studying beauty, you're asking, there are a couple of questions that are implied by such a thing, which is, how do you make it, and then how do you enjoy it, right? How do you study it, but also how do you enjoy it? Like what? And maybe that's getting a little too weird, but like that is an important thing. You have to recognize that the database is not really supposed to be beautiful, and when you're looking at this type of media, database constructed media, you're not really going to find. If you find beauty there, it's going to be in spite of itself, in my opinion. I could be wrong about that. I haven't thought that deeply about it yet, but that's sort of where I'm standing here. But the more important reason, the more relevant reason that I'm even doing this presentation is for the second reason, which is propaganda, right? And this is something Azuma does not touch on at all, because for the most part, the propaganda you're going to find in otaku media is propaganda that is not aimed at us. We're not even going to pick up on it if it's there. Some of it is there, but for the most part, like, we're not, because we're not we're not, unless you are Japanese, unless you are actually an otaku, like, that's a little different. But I'm expecting you not to be, just because I just assume that's the case. I'm assuming everybody I'm talking to is basically me, because I'm just sitting in front of my computer screen. But my point is, the propaganda exists to target specific demographics and specific groups of a society, usually nowadays kind of internally, but it can be projected. It used to be externally more, but it's for control. So propaganda, when we're watching and consuming things that are openly propagandizing, specific pieces of propaganda, you'll find that propaganda functions better when a person's understanding of media is already broken into this kind of database framework. Like, where when you're already going into a piece of media and you're expecting not to try and get a story that's actually going to put you, that's actually going to lead you along in a certain way and is a cohesive whole, dependent upon itself, without necessarily significant external, cross references or anything like that. That's not going to be as easy to turn into a piece of propaganda as the database. Once you're using a database, and once you've conditioned your consumers to be looking for everything according to a database, to be putting everything into a database, now you have the playing field ripe for just propaganda. So in Western culture that we see, contemporary culture that we see. Again, I'm not talking about Japan. I can't speak on that account. But you look at the MCU, you look at Star Wars, you look at video games nowadays, like the big budget ones. I would say comic books, but that's kind of an old dead meme at this point. You see propaganda across the whole playing field. Everything is pushing certain kinds of top-down narratives through everywhere from like sexual revolution to certain attitudes about your culture, things like that. I'm trying not to get too spicy on my first episode, but you get the idea. If you've been paying attention, and if you've been, if you're already aware of this type of thing, you look at this and you think, all right, Hollywood's always had certain kinds of tendencies toward, certain kinds of liberal tendencies that they put in movies, but they still used to actually be able to make movies that were enjoyable, right? And I'm not even talking about back in the golden age when you had the Hays Code and movies were actually good. They kind of fell apart in the 70s or 60s, but before, you still, even after that fell apart and you kind of had crap movies being made, they were still at least watchable. They were still movies. They're like, all right, these movies are still movies. They're not these kinds of movies that only are just ripped apart and put back together by a committee, which is what most of these blockbuster movies are. So what changed, right? And really what changed was the propaganda got a little bit heavier. I'm starting to lose where I was going with this, so again, apologies. Have a little bit more water here. Trying to do this in a way that makes sense. And looking back, I'm pretty sure none of this has made any sense. So apologies. Apologies. I tell you what, I actually, a couple of years ago, I did some streams with a co-host, and that was a lot easier, man. It's tough going solo. So we're almost done with what I wanted to be talking about, and I'm actually pretty much right on time. The talked about propaganda, why it's working because people have been conditioned to consume media this way, right? Azuma actually talks about where this media consumption pattern and tendency comes from, and he mentions in the book, he mentions games as a perfect model of understanding this. Mainly the visual novels, which if you've never played one, it's not going to make any sense. But the way that the visual novels are put together, and the fact that they are stories that have this sort of tree, tree diagram progression, but also when you break the, when you break, when you hack the game a little bit and sort of peer behind the curtain, like this database model is literally a database. Like it's a database of these different characters that have different sprites, and they're in front of different backgrounds, and these backgrounds are interchangeable with these sprites, and the dialogue is sort of put on top of this thing. Like he gets into pretty cool detail about it, but in his own way. But think back for a second and step back away from that, because maybe that doesn't make too much sense. Think of this in the sense of what kind of databases have we been conditioned to use? If you're a millennial, like myself, pretty much almost from birth, and that's the internet, right? Now, millennials, fortunately, are pretty much the last generation to not literally grow up on the internet. Zoomers, however, have, and it's just been totally conditioned. It's affecting the way that you think, and especially how you consume media. By you, I also mean me. Because when you're looking at how you browse the internet, right? You're looking at search functions, you're looking at categories, tags, navigating categories to get to specific things that you're looking for, right? Well, you end up, what are we talking about, right? That's the same thing as consuming media using this database model, except you're intentionally doing it when you're using the media, when you're using the internet, because you're looking for something specific, or if you're looking for something non-specific, but you're just looking to be entertained by something. You're like, all right, well, I want to find content X, content in this particular vein, so I just type in a few tags into a search engine, and boom, there it is on my screen, flat on my screen. Behind that screen, so to speak, is behind that process was just a search function going through this database, or many databases, to drag up these things that you're looking for. What does that sound like, right? What does that sound like? That sounds like a perfect place for propaganda to be curbing what you're looking at, what you're trying to find. Of course, nowadays, big tech censorship, massive thing. It's been a big, massive thing for years. And that's exactly what big tech has been doing to internet searches. Well, they're doing, now not big tech per se, but like the same phenomenon is occurring in media, right? Except because we've been conditioned, and because we have conditioned ourselves to be consuming media using this kind of database model, all you have to do is start changing, switching pieces out of this database piece by piece, until the database that me, the consumer, is now consuming is just full of this, of these narratives that I'm not supposed to, that before I didn't like, and now I've been conditioned to want to like, to want to find, or it's just, that's the only option I have left. And now all I have to do is figure out what my tolerance and my threshold is before I just decide to stop watching it altogether. So I don't know. That's pretty much what I got. This was a mess. I'll let you know that. This was a complete mess. Apologies. If you stuck through to the end, congratulations. You've You've passed the course. I'll put you down for an A. The got you a couple of people here that are watching. Cool. All right. Well, hopefully it was valuable, or interesting, or you got something out of it. Because I tell you what, I don't remember anything I just talked about, other than something to do with Hiroki Azuma and database theory and propaganda. But yeah, that's that. If I do this again, I'll tell you one thing. I'll be a little bit more prepared, I hope. Anyway, let's see. We have, actually, there's, did I use this one already? Okay, yeah, this basically is talking about how we're consuming it, but again, it's a really kind of a convoluted mess of a diagram. That's continental philosophers for you, right? We'll just let that stay there. In other news, let's see. Will I do this again? I don't know. I might, but I don't know. We'll see. The content on the website is a little bit slow this month because I'm doing some back end work. I do plan on doing more Catholic stuff, both on the site and going forward, because there's some big. I can't quite announce it all yet, so there's still some big stuff coming in the pipeline in the future. But yeah, I'm trying to think, probably 2 weeks, maybe 2 weeks. I'll be able to really announce it and hit the ground running. And let's see. There's I'd like to get to some Dietrich von Hildebrand stuff. Again, we talked about aesthetics earlier. That would be a lot of fun because yeah, that guy is amazing. His writing is just absolutely brilliant. And well, that's about it. So let's see. Today was the feast day of St. Pius V, and I thought yesterday was the feast day of St. Catherine of Siena, but according to my Carmelite calendar over here, that's today, the 30th. So I don't know how this works, but if we could have both of their prayers, that would be very wonderful. Maybe I should have asked for that at the beginning, and maybe this would have gone a little bit better. Well, anyway, I hope all of you had a wonderful feast day, a wonderful Friday, and thank you. That'll be it. That'll be it for today. Take it easy, guys.